your source for news, commentary, discussion, and debate at the intersection of the atheist movement and the LGBT rights movement. This is the Atheist Manifesto. From Answer Media, this is the Atheist Manifesto. I am your host, Callie Wright, and today is another kind of special episode. So remember when we started the new format, I promised that the sort of in-depth personal interviews that we had done before, that those weren't going totally away? Well, this week we're doing one of those. Every once in a while, I have a conversation with someone that just totally re-energizes me. When you do activism, you do a podcast, you give talks, it's really easy to get caught up in the mechanisms. It's easy to get caught up in the process. It's easy to lose sight of the reason why we do the things we do in the first place. Then I have a conversation like the one you're going to hear on the show today. I met John Nwosu at a talk I gave at Georgia Southern University some time ago. Between you and me, he was kind of my favorite person in the crowd. He asked really tough, probing, thought-provoking questions, and we became friends on Facebook, and he does the same kind of thing there. He reached out to me after a video surfaced of a famous black activist sort of implying that trans women couldn't be women because of their experience growing up and being socialized as boys. John wanted to get my perspective on that and hear my responses. And it turned into a conversation that I and he both actually thought should be a public one. It was kind of funny, actually. We both sort of stopped the conversation at the same time. And he asked in our Facebook conversation if he could post our conversation on his blog. And at literally the same time, I was typing a message asking if he'd be willing to have this conversation via Skype to post as an episode of the show. Great minds and all that. So we did just that. We had a really great, broad-ranging conversation about the ways we do activism, the way we navigate tough situations in our own communities, and telling stories as a form of activism. I've never had a conversation for the show that I didn't love, but I think this one is truly special. So I hope it means as much to you as it does to me. Enjoy. So we started an interesting conversation yesterday, and I think we kind of interrupted it because we both realized that we wanted it to be public in some way. So do you just kind of want to start with where that conversation started?
Oh, sure. Chimamanda Adichie has some really interesting comments. At least on the surface, they were pretty interesting. But I naturally want to dig deeper about stuff. And so it just struck me kind of weird what she was saying. And I just had some dissonance. And I reached out to a few people. You were one of the people that I reached out to and just kind of asked what your thoughts were on that. And I was interested because of how you identify, because of how we connected in the first place, and also because of how you post and how I see you interact with other people. I thought that you would be a great person to really reach out to and get an idea of like how you felt about stuff. But yeah, from there, you gave some really dope feedback, and I definitely appreciate the way that you framed it and the way that you expressed what you were saying, because some of it I other people had expressed, but other parts of it were like, it was new. It was synthesized in a new way. So I really appreciate that. But like from that flowed conversations about advocacy in general and how we do this work, and just how sometimes there's like this feeling to want to appease the crowd or whatever the crowd is looking for. But for me, and it seems for you, the greatest connection or the greatest opportunities to change people's minds has come from just connecting with other people through stories and your own experience and other experiences from other people. And then we also talked about just having that balance between the stories and the facts, because there are some people who won't rock with you unless you have the facts. Yeah. Right. So, and then all of a sudden mid conversation, it was like, you know what I was thinking?
Right. Great minds think alike.
Yeah. So good.
So for context, the comments that we were talking about, and I know this was kind of shared around among all of my like social justice-y friends. I'm not sure how far outside of those circles that it went, but basically it boiled down to someone asked her if she thought trans women were women. And she said, well, I think trans women are trans women. And she dug a little deeper into that, saying that because trans women aren't necessarily socialized the same way that cis women are, that the experience is different. And that I don't think she said it explicitly, but I think the implication was that you can't have a full understanding of the woman's experience if you, in any part of your life, were socialized as a guy. So there are a couple layers of this that I responded to, because I think, one, it sort of gets at the core of what makes us identify one particular way or another. Is it this characteristic about us that informs our life experience? Is it, especially when we're talking about marginalized people, whether we're talking about race or gender identity, sexuality, any of that kind of stuff, does that identity flow specifically from the oppression that you face for being that identity? I think if we're being realistic, because I've seen people say unequivocally, like, trans women cannot ever, possibly ever at all benefit from male privilege. And like, I get where the impulse comes from for that, but then I think about like the older white trans women in my community who, didn't transition until their 50s, when they've got fat savings account and fat 401ks.
Right.
And so they still have that idea when they look at a younger person who's transitioning and they're like, well, I made a hardship withdrawal from my 401k and paid $20,000 for my surgery by myself. Why can't you pull yourself up by your own bootstraps?
Right.
So like, I think it's tough to say that there's not an element of privilege in there that comes from having been perceived, at least from the outside, to be a specific way your entire life. And, I don't know, maybe that's an unpopular thing to think, but it's the only thing that makes sense to me, because then we have to talk about when a person comes out and when a person transitions, because, even if a person doesn't come out and transition until their 50s or 60s, if they've known who they were since they were a kid, because not all trans people do, not everyone realizes from the time they were a kid that they're trans. Some people don't figure it out or even have an inkling that they may be until their 50s or whatever.
Right.
But, if you have to live your life in the closet at all, that does change the experience, right? I came out at 28. I knew who I was at 12. So I had the experience of everyone thinking I was a thing and knowing I was not a thing. So that's not really the same as being socialized as a guy. It's being pressured into being something by society that you're not. And so even so, it's tough. I think I'd be lying if I said that I never got any kind of benefit from people thinking I was a guy, having my opinion listened to on a higher level, or, people taking me more seriously, like that kind of thing. Like, I think it's hard to say that there is no benefit from that, but to say that your experience isn't real because of that, I think is way, way too far to go, because then we have to ask ourselves, is a rich woman who has been able to sort of buy her way out of a lot of the sexism that, the average woman feels, is that, does that make them less of a woman because they experience less of that oppression? And I think that gets to how much of our identity is wrapped up in the things that we face for being part of one marginalized group or another. Do you have thoughts on that?
So that was exactly the part that really resonated with me. And I guess when Adichie was speaking, like what was implied is that I think of like a Venn diagram, and I think of, two circles. And so inside, like, there are two separate circles in one situation, right? So what Adichie was saying, trans women are trans women. It's like, okay, there's this circle with women, and in that circle are tall women, short women, masculine women, lesbian women. And then outside of that circle exists trans women with all of those other things. And what I kind of like have been just gathering, and I think, I'm still trying to process and understand and learn more about it. But yeah, like what really I think a lot of people have issue with is that there are two separate circles, and not, okay, trans women is in the same circle next to tall women and short women and women who can, get pregnant, and women who menstruate, and all these other factors that we kind of look at to determine whether or not someone is a woman. And even me as a man, like me speaking on this, I feel, as a cis man, I feel kind of challenged in finding my role and what this space needs to look like. But the other piece is that I think the privilege and oppression piece is so important to consider, because we like to make everything as simple as possible, and we live in this dichotomous situation right now, and it's like either or, it's black or white, but really it's more gray. And I think you hit exactly on that, because at the end of the day, I think privilege is not just about what happens at the individual level, about how it's received. It's also about what is given, what is granted, what is assumed about you. And so to that extent, part of our identities are ascribed, right? So if you're male passing, then there are a lot of people who will treat you differently, which you just spoke to. And I think I've had conversations with friends around this who are like kind of on one end or the other. It's like, nah, you can't have it at all. And on the other end, it's like, well, you definitely have it. Every single trans person has cis privilege or has male privilege. And I think it's more gray, just like what you were saying. So it's like that piece about how you receive it. I think some people are either focused on that or they're focused on who is actually giving it and how they're extending those privileges. And I think the last piece that I kind of like that kind of came up for me while you were talking is one of my friends who was kind of against the whole trans women experiencing male privilege piece was really adamant about making sure that we don't speak for them or we don't or that we really for you all making sure that we have an opportunity to really like center your voices. But so what she did was actually tag me to what is her name from Orange is the New Black? Laverne Cox. Yes. So she tagged me to like one of her tweet threads, and Laverne really hit on some really interesting points that resonated with me, which were like around, okay, her growing up, she knew for a long time that she was trans. And so she's always been a woman, right? And she was treated oftentimes like a boy. And so she made a point where she was like, it's interesting that when I was a boy, quote unquote, people treated me more like a girl. But now that I'm a woman, people treat me more like a man, because she always was kind of feminine leaning. And she felt like there were times where she didn't fit within that paradigm of black male masculinity. And so she was treated different because of it. She also spoke to moments where she did pretty well academically, but there were girls in her class who performed better than her. But when she was performing as a boy, experienced more support than those girls because of her perceived gender. So that to me spoke to exactly what we're talking about here. Like it's more complicated than it is. You know what I mean? And I think that's exactly kind of, the best stance to take from all of this is just understanding that it's not black or white, and every experience is different. And I think the very last piece is that she spoke to just how many narratives are outside of that masculine man turning woman narrative that people associate stereotypically with the trans experience. And it's like, well, there are a lot of people who weren't male passing, and there are a lot of people who, have known for a long time, and all the things that you spoke to already. I think that piece is important too, because that stereotypical narrative is so pervasive. It's like you were a man and now you want to be a woman, and that's just so clearly incorrect.
And I remember a couple of experiences, because, even before transition, when I was still perceived as a guy and I was as deep in denial as I could possibly be, I still had a lot of what people would consider to be feminine traits. I've always been super emotionally sensitive. I've always cried really easily. I've always been really, really like emotionally aware, and sort of like, I guess emotional intelligence is the way to describe it. And I remember a couple of times specifically, I used to play in bands and we toured and we played shows out of town and we played music festivals and stuff. And I remember one time in particular, we played a music festival, and it was sort of at the peak of whatever, regional popularity we had. And so we got to play on the stage. There were probably 750 kids packed under this tent. And it was just like, it was everything a musician could ever possibly want from a show. Like, people were moshing, because we were a metal band. So people were moshing, the stage was shaking, and PA speakers were falling over. And like, it was nuts. And so after it was over with, I was just kind of standing at the back of the tent like, wow, this just happened. This is incredible. This is something that I've dreamed of my entire life, to like play a show and have a crowd react this way. And I was standing around with my band guys, and we were all just like, oh my God, that was awesome. That was so cool. And I just started crying, and I was just, and I did what you would stereotypically associate with being the woman thing to do. And I grabbed somebody and I hugged them, and I was like, oh my God, I can't believe I got to do this with my best friends. This is the greatest day of my life. Like, they were
looking at you side-eyed.
And so there's, well, right. And there was nothing malicious about it. Right. But it was kind of that joke, like, oh, they're crying again, And I'm just thinking to myself, like, because, again, it goes back to what we define as masculine and feminine, right? Because, guys are allowed to be sensitive. Guys are allowed to be emotional and have those kinds of moments and connect with each other. But I think, it's a taboo thing to do in society. Like, I was trying to connect, like, oh my God, I just had this super emotional, happy experience. And like, I want to connect and like, I just want to cry with somebody. And, but it was, and I don't know if that's just, who some of them genuinely are as people, if they're just not the kind of people to get emotional like that, or if it's the expectation of masculinity that's like, oh yeah, no big deal, been here before, it's cool, whatever. There are a couple of times where things like that happen, where it's like, I'm really emotional about a thing, and in a way that you would stereotypically associate with womanhood. And like, I was like trying to connect with other people, and I wasn't, because people are just like, what the hell is going on? Like, this doesn't make any sense, And it's difficult when you realize those dynamics, and I think again, that kind of speaks to the difference between growing up as a person who is a cis guy and secure in whatever manhood means to you, in being perceived one way and being expected to behave a specific way because of how people perceive you, and knowing on the inside that that's not who I am, and that's not who I want to put myself out there as being, and I don't have any interest in acting this way, but I almost feel like I have to, because I'm hiding, right? And if I do this, I'm going to betray myself, and everybody's going to know what's going on. They're going to start digging, and then I'm going to have to be like, I'm going to have to come out before I want to, and there's just like this whole complicated range of emotions and thoughts that are informed by outside pressures and cultural programming, and yeah, it's a mess.
Yeah, absolutely. And even while you were talking, what was coming up for me was a book I'm reading. Have you ever heard of a book called Ethical Slut?
I have heard of the book. It's on my list.
Okay, good stuff. So they were speaking about closeted individuals, and not just in the sense of folks who are gay or lesbian, or folks who are who don't identify as straight or gender conforming or anything like that, right? They were talking about in the sense of what are the things that you feel really comfortable with and don't feel comfortable with, and that you wouldn't necessarily tell other people, and if they found out, you would feel really embarrassed or feel hurt in some way. And so as you were talking, I think we all have those things where we're like, I don't want other people to know. And I think what makes it really different is that for me, those things aren't like, my closet is not the same size or the same shape, or I'm not dealing with the same stuff that you might have been dealing with when you were questioning whether or not you were assigned the right gender. And I think for me, like, I could relate to some of what you were saying. I was like, yeah, there's some things that I used to be really embarrassed about, but it's just not the same. And I walked into spaces. For instance, I have a friend now, my best friend. And we're in our friend group, we're talking about the show This Is Us. Have you heard of it?
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So This Is Us, like, my friend, my homeboy, and I, we're like, yo, this part made me cry. And like, yo, I shed a tear here. And, those are conversations I wouldn't have had 10 years ago with him. And I think because that was like a closeted situation for me, like, oh, yeah, I do emote. Surprise, like, I'm a guy, I'm black,
right.
And I do emote.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, that's something that with time and with like understanding myself and accepting myself more, and then also testing those boundaries with him, I've been able to, have different conversations that I wouldn't have otherwise had with him. I couldn't imagine what it would be like to have to question, my other aspects of my identity. I think the piece for me that I connect most with you on is my race, because that is something that I feel persecuted about, or religion. Oh, that we actually connected over religion,
right?
The first time, but yeah, having to like keep my parts of my identity secret from other people, or not even secret, but just be very intentional about how I share them, I think is really, really a challenge for me. So as far as like crying and as far as like, that type of stuff, I think race adds another layer to it, because
I was actually just about to ask about that.
Great minds. But yeah, I think race adds a different component to it because of all of the strict stereotypical ideas that people have about folks of color, specifically Black people. It's like man, we internalize that stuff, and then we kind of expect that stuff, both consciously and unconsciously when we're interacting with other people. So like me right now, I work with kids. And so it was almost just like part of my role was to be the disciplinarian, but I'm a counselor. And so that's not supposed to be at the central part of my identity when I'm interacting with these kids. But I feel thrust in these positions. And I feel like what people are saying without saying is, you need to get this kid in check. Right. And they're looking at me as the black man to instill discipline, but usually in a more physical, or not physical, but more direct and forceful type of way. And that's not my style. And so by me coming at it from more of a soft perspective, more of a permissive perspective with flexible boundaries, like if I ask a kid to do something once, I'm not going to try to get them written up. I'm going to talk to the kid. I'm going to ask them questions like, hey, what are you supposed to be doing right now? Okay, well, why aren't you doing that? Okay, well, I think you need to do that, right? And taking that time to really be patient with that kid and talk to them about how they feel and stuff like that. That part is, I don't know that guys are supposed to do that, especially not black guys. And I think I feel that. And I don't know how much of that is external pressure versus things that I've internalized over the years, but I'm very critical about myself and how I'm interacting with other people. And I think a lot of it has to do with my race and what I think other people expect of me. And so once I get through all of that, like once I can feel comfortable enough to just be and just talk, usually that's when I feel like I'm most able to connect with people. I feel like most free, most comfortable, but it's really challenging for me to get to those spaces because of all the other things that I think, but don't know for sure, other people are saying, thinking, believing about me and how I interact with other people. And I don't know that type of situation exists with white people in the same way that it does people of color. Actually, I believe that it doesn't.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, what's your take on that?
Yeah, well, I think people really underestimate how their expectations can influence the way people act, because and you hear this in parenting all the time, and I'm not a parent, but this is just, things that I've read from other people. They're talking about, like, you have to expect things of your kids if you want kids to act a certain way or to think a certain way. And I think that speaks to sort of a broader human psychology, right? If if you grow up in a society that expects you to be a thing and, pushes you towards being that thing because of their expectations, it's really tough to not become that thing. And it can create all sorts of internal conflicts. And I think, you and I probably experience a different set of those expectations, but I do think there is some intersectionality there in the concept itself, right? Because, we grow up in a society where if you're a black man, everyone expects that the only emotion you can feel is anger, right? And like, that's obviously not true. It's silly that you even have to say that. But I mean, that's the society that we live in, right? I mean, that's just the expectation that's placed on black men, is that you're just angry and that's the only emotion you can feel, and that you're hard and that you're otherwise emotionless. And I mean, I can only imagine speaking of closets, the sort of closet that forces you into, and, being able to talk about your feelings and that kind of stuff. There's a really great TED Talk by an activist called Ash Beckham, and she talks about working in a restaurant, and as a very butch, sort of masculine presenting lesbian woman, she's, wearing cargo shorts and t-shirts, like close cropped hair, and, just your stereotypically butch lesbian presentation. And she's serving these people food, and this little girl looks up at her and asks her if she's a boy or a girl. And she talks about this impulse that we have as activists, and I know I have it too, and you may too, that like when somebody asks you a question like that, you immediately want to go into activist mode. Like, well, what makes you think that it's your right to know? And like, you immediately turn on the activist brain and you want to start preaching. And then you turn around and you look at this little kid who doesn't know any better because they grow up in the same society we do. All of the terrible ideas that we got about gender or race or, so on and so forth, they got it too, and they haven't had enough life experience to get outside of this yet. So can we really be mad at them for asking questions like that? And so she starts thinking about how people trying to connect with each other. And she's talking about closets and how what a closet really is a hard conversation. It's a thing that you need to talk about but can't for some reason. And, if somebody ends up with a terminal illness, that's a closet you have to come out of. Those different kinds of things. And she talks about, these questions where like somebody, they find out you're gay and then they immediately want to tell you about this gay person that they know. And they're like, oh my gosh, I have a gay friend. Here's their name. Do you know them? And I'm sure, as a black person, you experience that too. Like, oh yeah, I have a friend who's black. Do you know him? Because all black people, all trans people, all gay people know each other. Right.
Right.
And,
exactly.
And so, and I think about this a lot when people find out that I'm trans, if it comes up in conversation. People find out that I'm trans and they want to tell me about their gay friend. And I'm like, and again, my activist brain turns on, right? Like, that's not the same thing. You're comparing two things that are different. And like, I want to do the activist thing. But then I think to myself again, like, there is a level to which I shouldn't feel obligated to hold that person's hand and walk them through how ignorant that is to do. But at the same time, I have to believe that as a white person, as a middle-class person, if I hadn't been trans, if I had been born cis, in a cis guy or a cis girl for that matter, I think it would have been a lot longer of a journey for me to figure these things out if it wasn't a personal experience for me. So what I'm thinking to myself is, here's a person who, in whatever way they are able, in whatever frame of reference they have, they're trying to connect and they're trying to relate. I want to sort of have a compassionate approach to that, right? Like, I don't want to jump out with like, well, that's a silly thing to say. You're obviously ignorant and I'm going to educate you and I'm going to make you a perfect social justice warrior, like you want to do those things, or at least I do. But then you think about, where we were talking about our conversation, what do we do when we actually want to change someone's mind, right? Because I have this conversation a lot with activists, especially in the atheist community, because I think, yeah, you laugh for the same reason I'm laughing, trust me. Because I feel like
the angry atheist.
Exactly. There are people who have a fetish for anger, and there are people who have a fetish for diplomacy, and will never step outside of either of those two paradigms because that's the thing that makes them feel the best, right? So the angry atheist is telling this religious person how everything they believe is a lie. It's all ridiculous. You're silly for believing it and that kind of thing. And then they're like, well, told them, that's my atheist activism for the day. Well, on the other side of that, that person is just like, wow, that's just an angry, that's an angry atheist. There was no actual conversation happening. There was transmission, but no receiving. On the flip side of that, there are people who are the diplomats, right? The people who are always going to hold people's hands. They're always going to ask the soft questions. They're always going to, sort of do the Socratic method and ask questions and be nice and keep conversation going and that kind of stuff, because that's what makes them feel good. After that conversation's over with, they're like, well, at least the conversation's going. I was nice. I made a connection. And so that's what makes them feel good. And I think on both sides of the argument, a lot of times, the thought is not about what is going to accomplish a changed mind. The thought is, here's the activism that feels good to me, therefore I'm going to do that kind of activism. And I think you and I both know that there is value in both approaches, right? Because there are some people who won't respect you unless you're aggressive. And there are some people who won't listen unless you're soft. And it's difficult to know which is the right approach. So I imagine when you're talking about issues of race, I feel like there's probably a similar sort of dichotomy in the approach and a similar sort of disagreement in the community about what's the right way to approach it. Am I right in thinking that?
Oh, definitely. And when you said earlier about the compassion piece, like I sometimes I feel guilty about being compassionate.
Oh God, me too.
Especially when it's like, I guess the group that's been your identified enemy. So it's like for me, my assumption is that as a black person, white people are the enemy. Like that's like what's kind of been implicitly taught to me in many different ways. And in a lot of ways, white people do represent danger for me, but that's not true for every single white person in every single situation. You know what I mean? And I think like to to be compassionate with the quote unquote enemy, right? It just feels wrong. And a lot of people approach it and approach me as if I am doing something wrong for wanting to quote unquote handhold. You know what I mean? And I think you spoke to the fact that if you had not had such a personal experience with that part of your identity, then you wouldn't be where you are right now. And I think everyone is at a different place on their journey, and it's important to understand that. For me as a counselor too, so much of what I've been trying to do is allow people space to be themselves, to learn and grow on their own terms. And so that kind of presents a struggle for me as well, because a lot of people that I have been trained by and a lot of people that I work with are white. And so the culture of that space is a particular way to interact with people a particular way, to respond to people a particular way. And that's not always the case in every type of cultural setting. And that's not the best way to interact in every type of cultural setting. So finding balance between what I've been taught, what I've been trained to do, and like who I am and what works, I think is where I am right now. And I still struggle with that. As far as just like interacting with people, I think that understanding like what your strategy is really important. And I don't think that I think sometimes we're short-sighted, right? Because it feels good if you're an angry person, or if you respond best to anger, if that's your mode of expression that works best for you and feels most comfortable, then that's what you're going to do. And that's kind of short-sighted, because if you're dealing with someone who responds the exact opposite to anger, then what you're doing is going to be ineffective. But of course, that depends on what your goal is, right? If your goal is just to express how you feel, then you've achieved that goal. But if your goal is to be an advocate and to be an activist, then I think understanding the long game is really important. And I think that also helps create value in many different approaches that exist between those two extremes of addressing it directly and head on, and like kind of having more of a, I don't want to say passive, but more of a indirect or patient approach. But yeah, I think really getting clear on what our goals are is pretty important. And then keeping to have those conversations with different people who have different ideas and perspectives is important too. Because to be honest with you, I don't have the answers and I don't know. There are some answers that I do have, but the stuff that we're trying to tackle has been in existence for millennia. You know what I mean? Like people have devoted their entire lives to this stuff, and still, there's no absolute understanding of it. Or maybe we do know what to do. We just don't know how to go about creating that reality, right? We know we need to treat people nice, right? We know we need to respect folks. We know that compassion is important. Most of us do anyway. But we live in a society that doesn't necessarily value those things as much as money or class or different other hierarchies. So, I mean, I think the issue around just what is the best way in this moment to achieve whatever my ultimate goal is, I think that thought process is helpful. But even then, every moment is different. Every situation is different. Every person is different.
Yeah. Well, and it's hard because, doing that is pretty serious emotional labor, right? Like
Absolutely.
If you're a person of color who has had nothing but terrible experiences with white people, and now you're being told you need to go out and be nice and handhold, like I think putting that expectation on people is not an okay thing to do.
No.
Even though we're talking about that may be the thing that fixes a thing, I think we have to also respect the fact that some people just can't get there because of whatever experience they've had. And I think it's wrong to obligate people to do that. It's hard because, we need people like I've gone on conservative talk radio in Cincinnati 3 times at this point. And I mean, that's the den of the enemy, right? I mean, these are the
right.
people who think that I am just, the representation of the moral downfall of society. But, because otherwise in life, I'm relatively privileged. Like, I mean, I have a decent job. I don't worry about where food's coming from day to day. So like that puts me on a level of privilege where I don't have that kind of trauma that makes it extremely difficult for me to interact with people like that, to try to push that change. And so like I even bristle when I do things like that. People will say, gosh, I wish more trans people would do what you do. And I'm like, that makes me feel really uncomfortable, because I'm in a place in life where I can do that, and I can do that without harming myself, because if I have a super frustrating conversation, I can hang up the call, cry a little bit, hug my girlfriend, and I've got this entire support system that, I'm good. whereas someone who's poor, someone who doesn't know where their next meal is coming from, and all of these things stem from the fact of them being trans, right? They can't get a job, they can't get welfare benefits because their identity documents don't match their presentation, so on and so forth. They're, then expected to, let's sit across the table and have this polite discussion with this congressperson who wants to make it even harder for me to exist in public. Like, I get the impulse to want more people to be doing things like that, but I think we also have to understand that our purpose isn't always changing minds. Sometimes our purpose is the survival and the well-being of our people, right? So, right. Sometimes the right approach is not to be patient and coddle someone who is being awful. If, they're being mean, in my case, if they're being mean to another trans person, in that moment, my approach is not toward changing that person's mind. My approach is to drawing a circle around the person who's being harmed and push the harmful person outside of it and stop the harm from happening. So then my approach is going to be different. And I think a lot of times people assume that every conversation about those issues that is in any way contentious has to be about changing someone's mind. And I think that's a very wrong-headed way to look at it. What do you think?
I think ideally it would be nice to really enter every conversation and think that you have a real shot at changing someone's mind. But I also think it's kind of unrealistic to expect that every time I engage with any person that they're in a space where they're ready for their mind to be changed. I don't think that that's real. I totally agree with everything else you said. And I think that kind of falls under the umbrella of like long term, what is your goal? And if your ultimate goal is to liberate people who are currently oppressed, I think that falls within that realm. It's just we don't expect that. And like you said, when you talk about any type of contentious conversation, we as a society are uncomfortable with conflict anyway. Like we don't know how to resolve it, right? We know how to get into it, but we don't know how to resolve it in a healthy way. So that part is challenging anyway. So like anytime you say something, like there are people who they've categorized me as racist because I've said the word white, right? And so I think just speaking to that, like the term white for some people as opposed to Caucasian, or even saying black instead of African American or brown instead of Latino, like using like that type of word is incendiary for some people. Like it makes some folks feel uncomfortable and like there's conflict present, and then they begin to back away from the conversation. So I think really just getting to the root of what people think, what they believe, who they are, what they understand is important. And I try to get there as soon as possible so I can better engage in whatever situation I'm in. And so when you mention like drawing a circle around the person that's being attacked or that is threatened or targeted, I really like that analogy. And in drawing that circle and pushing away people who are doing that attacking, you have to be able to identify like, hey, what is this person thinking and doing? And clearly you can tell a lot of times just what a person's intentions are. Like you can assume, I don't think that you can ever fully know what someone intends to do, but just by the way they're interacting, you can tell like, hey, is this person trying to have a fruitful conversation? Are they trying to contribute constructively, or are they trolling? Or are they like being unreasonably disrespectful for no good reason? And I think that can like also, I think that has to determine your response. I think you have to be responsive in this conversation. So like my normal state, like when I guess my default is more compassionate, more Socratic. Let me ask questions and let's see where they go. Hopefully towards a particular answer that I already have sometimes. But yeah, like if someone's not willing to engage, what can you do? And if what they're doing is dangerous, I think survival is that very first place that if you're still surviving, there are so many other things that are not on your radar that do not matter. And also last, I guess, to speak to just people who are a part of marginalized groups advocating for themselves. I mean, that is unfair. It is completely unfair that folks who are in minoritized groups are the ones who end up having to a lot of times push that needle forward. And that's an unfortunate reality. Like history tells us that those are the people who have to move that needle, whether we're talking about gender identity or race or class or nationality. It's those folks who aren't getting what they need, who are motivated enough to push that conversation forward. So I think it's important to have that honest conversation with people from marginalized groups, and also make sure that they understand it is look, it is okay. Like, if you're bleeding right now, or if your arm is broken or your leg is broken, I don't expect you to try to sprint right now. You need to be chilling, resting, healing. Right. And make sure that they understand that it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to heal. It's okay to tend to your wounds. And when you are ready, come engage in this fight. And as far as people who are in privileged groups, I think we have to do a better job of setting those expectations. Like, hey, how do we get you engaged and keep you engaged in these conversations, or find co-liberators who are already there, who really want to work, and lean on them more.
Quick break, and we'll be right back. We interrupt the Gaytheist Manifesto to bring you this important message from an asexual friend of the show. We're sorry for interrupting your disgusting displays of affection, but we'd like to remind you that the asexual community's goal of world peace is expensive because you're too busy thinking with your genitals. Angelica understands this. Angelica went to patreon.com/thegaytheist manifesto and made a donation to support the show this week. You should stop playing with yourselves long enough to do the same. Before we get back to the show, a few announcements. Ari and I will both be at ReasonCon. It's just under a month from now, April 21st and 22nd at the Crown Plaza Hotel in Hickory, North Carolina. ReasonCon is a very special place for me for a lot of reasons, and this year is going to be incredible. I'm giving a talk. We'll also hear from Matt Dillahunty, Jim Craig, Aaron Ra, the always amazing Shelley Siegel, and more. Head to reasonnc.com for tickets and to find out more. And later this year, on October 13th through 15th, I will be at the Pennsylvania State Atheist Humanist Convention. I'll be in some pretty amazing company there, too. We'll have Abby Hafer, Debbie Goddard, Gail Jordan, Alex Jules, and more. I know it's still early, but it filled up fast last time, and I'm sure it will this time, too. It's going to be a great time with great people. I hope to see you there. For more information, go to atheistpa.org. Now back to the show. What I see a lot of times too is these sort of hierarchies develop within marginalized communities of, people like, activists are at the top and the people who are like the marginalized are at the bottom, right? And everybody looks up to the people who are the activists, who are the ones who are doing the fighting and that kind of stuff. And I think that can be toxic too. Part of me understands the impulse because, I look at someone like Laverne Cox or Janet Mock or, other sorts of, prominent trans activists. And I look at them and I think, oh my God, they're doing so much. Like, I want to be like that. I want to do what they do. I want to have that platform and be able to speak to, that large of an audience and influence thinking on that level. And it gets to the point where you sort of end up thinking less of yourself because you can't do that, because you can't, sort of activist on that level. I think that speaks to a broader cultural influence of, you have to be well known and you have to be famous to be important or to do something that matters. And I mean, I catch myself feeling that way, even though I'm articulating a critique of that, of that way of thinking. I still fall into it because, just because of programming. It's the culture that we grow up in. Right. And I still I look at other people whose podcasts get more downloads than me, and there's still a twinge of jealousy there, like just being real. But I think it's really important to fight back against that impulse and understand that, at the end of the day, what we're all trying to do is make life better for people who are marginalized. And I think a lot of times we get caught up in the sort of mechanics of activism and, what conversation am I having today? What, group am I giving money to today? What volunteering am I doing today? Those kinds of things. And I think it's easy to get caught up in those mechanics and forget about what the goal is, right? Because like we were saying before, if the goal that we have in mind very specifically is, for example, I want it to be easier to be black in society. I want it to be easier to be trans in society. We reframe those things, and what does that look like? That doesn't always look like having a conversation with a Republican lawmaker and convincing them to change their mind. Sometimes that looks like making a person feel like they have a community who's going to fight for them and be lions for them. And I think it's about identifying those needs and doing those things for people and not giving into this hierarchy of, well, I'm a better trans activist because I go on conservative talk radio and talk to people, or, I'm a better trans activist because I sat down with a Republican lawmaker and talked to him about this bathroom bill that he was writing. I hate that mentality. I do those things because I have the capacity to have conversations with people. I feel like I'm decent at communicating. So like, that's my niche. That's what I do because it comes naturally to me. Right. But other people who do other things, even if that's just surviving, I had this conversation on an episode of the show before where I was talking about, sort of survival and self-care as activism. And that, I mean, it's a sad place to be when we have to say that, the fact that you exist and survive and find some happiness in life, like, that's resistance. And on one hand, that's kind of empowering, right? But on the other hand, it's like, is that seriously where we are in 2017? That, an act of resistance looks like just living your life? And I didn't even have that. I didn't have that realization until my guest on the show, because I am so deep in this. If you can do, city council meetings and meet with lawmakers and, get your face on TV, get your voice on the radio, all those kinds of things, that's sort of my wheelhouse in activism. So I get caught up in, like, that's how I personally try to make things better. But, if we look at the ways that other people do things, I think of myself when I'm trying to sort of empower myself. And I think, like, sometimes I burn out, I get tired, I get sad, I get depressed, and like, I withdraw, right? I spend the day with my girlfriend playing video games, or, I watch Star Trek on Netflix all day, or I'll listen to like a comedy podcast, or, something like that to escape. And I think to myself, like, this is still activism because I'm taking care of myself, right? We live in a society that, there are plenty of people who wish that I was dead, and also a large group of people who simply wish that I would just go away. And not giving in to either of those things is activism in itself. And so that idea has sort of normalized for me. And I say that to people all the time, like, it's okay to take care of yourself. Self-care is okay because that's activism too. And it took my friend Dan, who is a cis straight white guy. He was like, we can't continue to live in a world where simply living your life is an act of resistance. And I was like, shit, like, it hadn't even hit me. So it's like, it's weird that, in a way, coming from a privileged position gave me an insight that I didn't have before because I was so deep in it,
Oh, definitely. And it's funny that you said that Dan said that. There's a friend of mine who made a post about it basically was like, engage with the world as a straight white guy. Yeah. And that's the type of confidence that you need.
Yep.
And I think a lot of times, the Dans and the Sallys and they really provide perspective on me in terms of setting my expectations, right? And I think that it is challenging when you think about that, right? When you think the way you just framed it, like, if you have a bunch of people in the world, like a large percentage of them, too large anyway, like, wants you and I dead, or doesn't want to deal with us. And I think, really framing it in that way is powerful. And just really kind of, I think, understanding that, hey, in order to engage and do the work that is necessary to make sure that those people who do wish you harm do not succeed in their wishes, I think is important. And I mean, I still feel guilty sometimes, not as much as I used to, but like when I do take a break, when I just like breathe, when I disengage, I think that I always come back feeling better. Like, that's 100% true. And really being in tune with what my body and my mind are telling me, my emotions as well. And it's just really using that as feedback kind of helps support those decisions when I'm like, yo, I can't be on Facebook right now, or I can't really have this conversation, or, hey, I think that this group that I'm a part of is doing great work, but right now this is not the space that is most healthy for me to be in right now. I think being able to have those conversations kind of stems from having them with yourself first, and then hanging out with people who are open to have those conversations too. And a few minutes ago, when you were like, sometimes you find yourself playing into those hierarchies within activism, I think just being vulnerable really helps. And that's kind of how we got to this point anyway. Like, just acknowledging that sometimes when, you're talking, you're trying to, like, for me anyway, like this just happened at a panel that I sat on. Somebody asked a question that was like in my wheelhouse. Like she asked about liberating Black boys and how sometimes, a lot of times, Black boys face harsher responses for the same behavior that other students have, mainly white students. And so I'm like, okay, of course, let me get into the history of racism and let me use these big words and let me show out real quick. And I did not answer her question at all. And that kind of sparked me kind of like, oh, wait, like after like 5 minutes later, I was like, yo, I ain't answer her question at all. And I'm thinking like, man, that really sucks. And I processed that with my counseling supervisor and one of my colleagues, and they were just kind of like, well, you know, you do this, normally you do that, this might be helpful. And I can't express you how helpful it is to really just have people to bounce ideas off of and be vulnerable around. And people who are like-minded, they don't have to look like you, but as long as they, you know, support you and have ideas that can help what you're doing, I think that's really important. So the vulnerability piece is really important. And making sure that you have people who you can talk to and be real with, who can help you feel okay with taking time out for yourself, so that you can participate in the more active parts of activism, I think is really important.
I think you bring up something really, really important when you talk about vulnerability. And I think, you know, the people who connect with what I do on the show or what I do with public speaking and that kind of thing, it almost always comes back to me being vulnerable in some way, because, you know, at this point, I have no secrets, right? I don't think there is any aspect of my life that I have not sort of laid bare on the show. I mean, aside from like the mundane stuff, but like, you know, anything that I've ever struggled with, any big life decision I've ever made, you know, any of that kind of stuff, like I just lay it all out. And of course, a thing to remember is that the ability to do that is also a marker of a level of privilege, right? Because
Sure.
I know that whatever consequences I face for being that open are not going to be so bad that it makes me scared to do it. So I think that's an important thing to recognize on one level. And that comes back to sort of, you know, where our conversation turned initially was like, so, you know, what do? You initially asked me the question. So what's your elevator pitch? What do you do? What do you say when you're trying to engage with someone and change their thinking on, you know, trans issues? And I definitely, in a lot of ways, even doing the show and being vulnerable and knowing that like personal connections are the way to do things, when I'm having those conversations one-on-one and I'm sort of in activist mode instead of podcaster mode, which are like, there's overlap, but they're definitely different things. You know, I would, you know, you throw out the talking points, right? You say, well, this is fact A, this is fact B, this is fact C, and this leads to reality A, right? So in actually, I do a patrons only audio journal for people who give money to the show. And every week I just kind of write, it's like usually a 3 or 4 minute thing about just something that's been on my mind. And a lot of times it's personal stuff, like, you know, issues that I'm having with my body that I worked out in some way. So last week's or the week before, cause I'm not sure which episode this is going to be, I did a piece on storytelling as activism, because I think there are a lot of people who are into activism who also like things like the Moth Radio Hour or, you know, This American Life or, you know, like sort of storytelling shows like that. And I know, at least for me, it took me a minute to make the connection there that, you know, the storytelling and activism can be the same thing sometimes. And what started this, I don't know, are you familiar with the show Snap Judgment?
Yes.
Okay. So Glenn Washington, the host of Snap Judgment, he has a policy background. Like he used to be a politician. And the line that really crystallized it for me in this interview I heard is he's like, whoever tells the best story wins when it comes to policymaking. And I just thought to myself, and I was like, God, you know, that's really true. Like I can definitely think of times where my mind has been changed when it comes to, you know, discussion and debate and like, well, here's a fact, here's a way of looking at this that you may not have considered. And I thought to myself like, well, yeah, I guess, you know, I never looked at it that way before. My mind has changed. But all of the times that I've really made a deep connection, it's because somebody told a story, right? So I sort of do this thing in the journal where I'm like, okay, I'll spend a paragraph talking about how terrible trans healthcare is. So I just throw out the facts, right? Like trans people are turned away from emergency rooms because their identity documents don't match their presentation. You know, doctors don't know how to treat trans patients. Patients have to lead their own care, even though they're not doctors. There are, you know, very high barriers of entry to surgery and hormone therapy. And, you know, just this list of facts, right? And somebody can hear that and they'll say, gosh, that, that sucks. I'm sorry that's a thing. But if I go and I tell a story about someone I know who was put in a position where she needed this surgery or it was going to cause major health complications, so she performed surgery on herself.
Wow.
Right. So then I was like, I think I probably know which story evoked an emotional reaction and made you angry and made you want to do something about it,
That's real.
Yeah. And so that's just something that I've been thinking a lot lately about, because I think when it gets down to it more, I think even though I feel like I'm okay at the kinds of conversations where I'm, throwing out the talking points and making the arguments, like, I've been a debater since I was a kid. Like my mom was convinced I was going to be a politician or a lawyer when I grew up because of like, I enjoy arguing. I'm fairly good at it. But when it comes to what I think is actually, I don't know if I want to call it my gift, but like the thing that I feel like I'm best at is making connections on that level and just telling stories. And that comes from every single time I'm super vulnerable about something on the show. That's the thing that I get the most feedback on. Episode 4 of the show 2 years ago was when the bathroom bill thing started to become a thing. Like there were state legislatures were starting to introduce bills to make it illegal or make it really hard for trans people to use public bathrooms. Mm-hmm. And this was before Obergefell, so this was before marriage equality was a thing, but the writing was still on the wall. Like we pretty much knew it was going to happen. And it hit me while we were recording the segment. Like I hadn't thought about this. It hit me while we were recording the segment. And I thought to myself, you know what? They know they've lost the fight over marriage equality, so they're coming after us next. Mm-hmm. And I know that the trans community is in a lot of ways more vulnerable. This is going to have a body count. Mm-hmm. And I broke down while we were recording the show, and I almost stopped because I was like, oh my God, like I'm in no shape to record right now. I was crying hard. Mm-hmm. And then I kind of immediately thought to myself, I'm like, no, like these are the stakes, right? This is real. This is what's real. So, we can have all of the scathing commentary and the best satire and the best critiques and all of that kind of stuff. And it's not like that stuff doesn't matter, but I still 2 years later get feedback from people on that episode. So it's like, that's what people connect with. So I don't know. I've been trying to think of a lot of ways in which I can incorporate that kind of storytelling into activism. And I think that's, this episode of the show that we're doing here is a break from, I sort of been doing a new format for the show where we're actually doing that. We're telling a story, if we can, about a thing and sort of having a narrative and saying, well, here's this person's personal experience that illustrates this larger problem, and here's the context for it. And I'm hoping that people are able to connect even more in that way. So, any thoughts on that? I've been talking away for like 10 minutes now.
I've been listening away for like 10 minutes now. I think it's interesting that I haven't heard the previous episodes, but it sounds like we kind of followed that model. Like we began with a story of me reaching out to you and us having some dope feedback, and then just ta-da, we're having this conversation now. And even throughout, we've been talking, about experience, and we've been, kind of up here a little bit, but for the most part, we've been kind of pulling from our own experiences and sharing those stories. So, it seems like it's flowing through, even if this wasn't intentional to me anyway.
I think you're right about that. I actually hadn't thought about it that way, but I think you're right.
Yeah. And I think, man, for me, because I'm thinking about my own personal relationship, right? And so my girlfriend and I, what I have realized works the absolute best is when I can make sure that she feels heard and I can be vulnerable. And usually, maybe sometimes I have like a vulnerability hangover, but for the most part, usually when I can open up, she's more open. And when she feels hurt, she's more open, which opens me up. You know what I mean? And so I think those things are kind of gems that I think should apply, period. Like usually when I think of like when I've hosted a workshop or when I'm with a client or when I'm just talking to people, when I'm able to open up with them, or one of us is able to open up, it doesn't matter who. We just need one person to take that risk, that calculated risk. I don't think calculator is the right word. That constructive risk, and just know that there is something that you could lose, but also so much that you can gain from that, and understand that, that, like, yes, there is an opportunity for this to help in some way. I think that's kind of what I take away from this conversation, because every bit of the way there's been hey, here's how I feel about this. This may be unpopular. I might get pushback or blowback from this, but this is still how I feel. Like, all of the topics that we've discussed today, someone could possibly strongly disagree with. Someone does strongly disagree with. And I think being able to find pockets where you can push those boundaries is really important. And making sure that you're heard and that whoever you're talking to feels heard, and making sure that there are opportunities for you all to be vulnerable. I think that's kind of the key. And the more that we can provide opportunities and protections for people to do that stuff, I think that's kind of what moves people. Because even when you were sharing, the facts, I was like, yo, that's interesting. That was interesting. And I didn't know that. But then when you were like, man, there's this trans person who had to perform surgery on themselves, I was like, that elicited a different type of emotion. And that response leads to a different type of action. So I think, if we can really make sure that people are okay and safe to share what they really believe, and feel like they've been heard, like whether we're talking about a personal relationship between partners, or if we're talking about a large scale venue where you have one person lecturing or one person talking to a large audience, like, I think those are the keys to really creating a type of change, or lead to the type of change that, we're looking for.
I left our conversation feeling energized, engaged, enlightened, focused, and more motivated than ever to do the work that we try to do here with the show. I hope you took something away from it too. Let us know on the post for this episode. It'll be pinned to the top of our Facebook page at facebook.com/The Gay Theist Manifesto. We'd love to hear from you. And that, my friends, is going to do it for this episode of The Gay Theist Manifesto. Again, I want to say thank you to John. That was a fantastic conversation. I really look forward to doing more stuff like that in the future. You can find the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Gay Theist Manifesto. You can email us at thegaytheistmanifesto@gmail.com. I'm on Twitter at GaytheistCali. You can find the show on Twitter at The Gaytheist. If you want to support the show, you can go to patreon.com/The Gay Theist Manifesto, make a per episode donation to help us out. And if that's not something you can do, you can always head over to iTunes and give us a 5-star review. That is super helpful and helps grow the audience. Before we go, I want you to know that if you're lost, you're hurting, you're scared, if you feel like no one cares and no one understands, you need to know there's a community out here that loves you, cares for you, knows that you're capable of amazing things and that you are worthy of love. If you're struggling, please don't be afraid to reach out. Until next time, friends, this is The Gay Theist Manifesto.